Are we good? All right. Good evening, everyone. Here we are, a beautiful evening. And like I said, kind of feeling like back in the saddle we've had with Rich and Dorje's visit and the 4th of July and what else was happening, all this stuff. Um, Thursday's got a little discombobulated, but here we are. And I wanted to do a couple of different things tonight. We've been talking, as you know, about the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the incredible, oneness, harmony, you might say, between these significant moments in life and death and after death, and their complete correspondence with these three aspects, what are called the Buddha bodies uh, of our true nature. But there are some things that I just sort of ran across, and I just wanted to touch on them. And a little bit random. These are a little bit just sort of a grab bag of things, but I thought it might be useful. One was a statement I came across by Dzongtsar Khyentse. So many you might know him, a very active modern Lama, does a lot of, has a vast kind of international organization. It does a lot of wonderful things in Asia, but here too, translation projects and, really excellent work. And he's one of those lamas thoroughly educated in the West too. I don't know, he may have gone to Oxford or Cambridge. I can't remember, but completely conversant with Western culture and Western thought. Um, and he's talking about Longchenpa. Longchenpa is one of the great Dzogchen masters, one of the great Nyingma masters from the early 19th century. And Longchenpa said that in this age of decline, so this is Dzongtsar Khyentse saying this, Longchenpa said that in this age of decline, sentient beings have the highest level of emotions and are therefore very fragile. The master must show the utmost loving care and love to the disciple, speaking in the gentlest manner and language. Constantly criticizing and scolding disciples will make them tired and lose confidence. And I think that's really something to bear in mind because, you see the incredible kindness. I mean, I've noticed this with His Holiness Chetsang Rinpoche and Garchen Rinpoche. Um, when you have some, say, intellectual understanding of the Dharma and some sort of insight, perhaps, and you can see with another individual, especially, particular sentient being, you can see sort of where they're stuck in a way. And you can see, you understand these stories in the past. I mean, we have the extreme example of Marpa and Milarepa, but there are many others too, where the teacher kind of pulls the rug out from underneath the student. I mean, basically, almost all of the Chinese and Japanese koan system is that. And of course, these great stories of Mahamudra masters and Mahasiddha masters in the great tantric masters in India, very similar kind of thing, very kind of abrupt interactions, things that are very kind of perplexing and sometimes even devastating to the student. Look at the stories of Tilopa and Naropa. I mean, here's Naropa. He's like the head of Oxford. He's head of Nalanda, the greatest university in the ancient world. This tremendously educated and knowledgeable man. And what does he do? He goes out for a stroll, and there's a tea stand by the side of the road. If you go to India, you see these kinds of tea stands that are there. And here is this, incredibly ugly elderly woman who's managing the tea stand. And there's an exchange between them. And she's actually, I believe it was Tara manifesting in this way. So his arrogance came out. He just assumed that he was so smart and she was kind of like lower socially and all of that. Um, and she just pulled the rug out from underneath him. And he so shattered his belief system in the sense that he wasn't rejecting the Dharma, but he realized that his intellectual attainments were not enough, that there was this whole matter of realization. And so he was just kind of like wandering around in a stupor, and out of the like thunder coming out of the clear sky, he heard the name Tilopa. And somehow this generated great devotion in him, although he had no idea who Tilopa was. But he had this obsession. He had to somehow find Tilopa. He believed that Tilopa was his teacher, his root guru. And so he traveled all over, finding people. And finally, he did come to someone and said, "Oh, Tilopa. Well, I don't know anybody, a teacher by that name, but, in his travels. But here's this crazy man living on an island in the middle of this toxic alkaline kind of lake." And so Naropa got himself out there. And sure enough, Tilopa is his teacher. Tilopa wouldn't admit that he was his teacher. He first saw Tilopa taking fish and hitting them in order to prepare them for a meal. And of course, this is wildly against Naropa's beliefs, killing animals. But it's said in the story that Tilopa was able actually to snap his fingers and bring them back to life. So who knows in this level of realization. But nonetheless, you ended up with Naropa rather, following Tilopa around. They got off the island, went on various places, and there's very famous biography of the 12 deeds, the 12 great things that Tilopa put Naropa through. I mean, for instance, they're just, sitting there doing nothing. And over the hill comes a wedding party. If you've ever been to India, you can imagine this, because Gretchen and I were in a Holiday Inn of all things in Bombay, then called Bombay, and an Indian wedding party went by. And it was just like this riot of noise and trumpets and accordions and, kind of coarse kind of instruments, but joyous. But this whole thing of the extended wedding party dancing around. So a wedding party comes, and Tilopa says, if I had a real disciple, someone would go over there and get some of the wedding cake for me. And so Naropa does. He goes and he asks and is polite, and he gets some of the wedding cake, and he brings him back to Tilopa. And Tilopa is eating and says, "Now I want more." So he had gone beyond the bounds of Indian polite obligations and social niceties. And so Naropa went and was basically trying to steal some cake. And of course, the male relatives of the bride beat him up. So he went through 12 kind of things like this. And then it finally happened. They were walking across some sort of a wasteland, no trees. And Tilopa gave him the direction, make me a mandala right now. Offer me a mandala. There was nothing. At this point, Naropa had lost everything. Everything. He had nothing to make a mandala offering. Usually this was a very ritual thing where you had to find gold and make an offering to get certain things. You'll see even today in Tibetan ceremonies, these elaborate offerings that are made holding these mandalas, these constructed mandalas up. He had nothing. And in his desperation, what could he do? Well, he urinated in the sand, which allowed the sand to make it into a rough kind of mandala. And as he offered that to Tilopa, Tilopa took his sandal off and whacked Naropa across the face, knocking him out. And when he woke up, he was fully enlightened. So Longchenpa is saying in the 19th century, the 1800s, we basically don't do that anymore because the emotions are so strong. Sentient beings have the highest level of emotions and therefore very fragile. To me, that just resonates with like where our society is at right now. I mean, the sensitivity, you say the wrong word and people lose their jobs, but also the emotional reactions from people using a wrong word. It's amazing to me. But nonetheless, I thought that was a pretty good insight this morning. Then something else from Lama Tarchin's teacher, Tinley Norbu Rinpoche, who was the son of Dudjom Rinpoche, who was this really great teacher, who was the head of the Nyingma after the Chinese conquest. Let me just get to this. Yeah, so this is Tinley Norbu Rinpoche. True surrender comes from deep, pure, continuous reverence. If we honor Buddha's inconceivable teachings with sincere and noble devotion, they show us through our own experience the reason to respect wisdom qualities. Respect for self-awareness wisdom is the recognition that Buddhas guide all sentient beings away from the suffering of delusion. When there is no delusion, there is no cause of samsaric suffering. The essence of non-suffering is to be in awareness mind. We must simply believe and stay in that awareness. Surrender is the openness to clear, vast, limitless wisdom space. This openness means that we surrender through our practice to Buddha and his precious teachings, to luminous deity phenomena, to all visible and invisible sublime beings, including our teacher, and to our own wisdom mind. This is so at once, practical, down to earth, and yet so vast at the same time. True surrender comes from deep, pure, continuous reverence. But of course, what is the object of that reverence? It strikes me, you see in the world, people, there's this natural hunger that people have. Sometimes it's covered over, true, with just the busyness of life, you might say, or the unexamined life. But every one of us, whether covered or not, has this spark, this desire to know more, to be more, basically to find a stable happiness. Because we're all very aware, looking for happiness, and yet we're all very aware of the risks, the threats, the instability of our worldly happiness. And yet there's something in us that somehow, without even thinking, without even being able to articulate it, believes that there is a stable kind of happiness possible. Otherwise, why are we so frustrated when we don't attain that? Because we feel like we've been betrayed or tricked or something's wrong. So that sense of something wrong, that is the first noble truth. There's just something that's out of kilter. There's just something, the ancient Indians put their finger on it with their words. I wish next lifetime I'm going to learn Sanskrit, because when you come across it, it's so clear and so useful in the understanding of the Dharma. So they had this word, for the way that we see things wrong. We see things that are impermanent, but we see them, they somehow appear to us as being permanent. We see things that are dissatisfactory, but we see them as going to give us satisfaction. We see things as solid, but they really aren't. So these are the upside down views, the viparyashas, I think they're in Sanskrit. This was the term that apparently was used in ancient India for a ox cart where the axle was off center between the two wheels. And so you're going somewhere, right? But it's just lumpity. It's not smooth. There's lots of friction, there's heat, there's noise, there's all this effort you have to do to make it go. What should be just going smoothly is somehow becomes a source of suffering. This is so, wonderful to see in that way. So we have this sense of just somehow things are off, and consequently there's a hunger. And there's also a fear that maybe there's no answer to this. And what do? We cover it up with other distractions because that's like the scariest thing known, that there's no escape. We'd rather not think about it. Buddhism, in opposition to this, or in contrast to this, faces our mind directly, faces those fears. The upcoming Chud retreat, I mean, Chud is especially noted for just this quality. You actually evoke your demons. Traditionally, it was done in a charnel ground, I mean, it's like here, Mount Hope Cemetery, people go there, because it's a nice, peaceful park. But ancient India, the charnel ground was not a nice place. It was haunted by demons, raised all these fears of people, corpses that were half exposed, jackals, vultures. And so you evoke your own deepest fears and you give them form as demons. And then there are things you can do in the practice. This particular practice, Vajrayogini appears. She cuts off the top of your head, and your head becomes a skull cup, the top part of your skull. And then your body is dead and is thrown into that giant skull cup, which expands in size. And then through bodhicitta, the body is melted into this wonderful and transformed into this incredible nectar that satisfies everything and everybody. And then that is sprinkled to all the demons, and they're completely satisfied. So through this great mind of loving kindness and compassion, we actually not only tame the demons, but we transform them. So this is the genius of it. By facing it directly, we don't have to do all these side trips of just trying to ignore what's actually going on. This is the great power of Dharma, but it's also what's kind of scary. Even when people approach Dharma, they often don't have teachings like this, the full teachings of the Dharma teachings. And that's too bad, but it's sometimes because they can't handle the vastness of it and are looking for something in a more limited way. Maybe this will help me with my headaches. Maybe I'll be able to concentrate more at work. I can sleep better, get rid of some of my psychosomatic illnesses. There are all sorts of worldly benefits to Dharma practice, and there's nothing wrong with those benefits. But the importance is the view. If you have the vast view, you're doing something that is more than one lifetime powerful. And that's what gives the path a consistency, something more than just, a little way stop here. This is something much grander and therefore truly beneficial. You see someone like Gar Rinpoche and you just think, my goodness, there is not only a way out, but kind of a state beyond bliss to exist in, and naturally helping sentient beings. The fact that it's all true. But there hints Tinley Norbo Rinpoche. True surrender comes from deep, pure, continuous reverence. If we honor Buddha's inconceivable teachings with sincere and noble devotion, they show us through our own experience the reason to respect wisdom qualities. Respect for self-awareness wisdom is the recognition that Buddhas guide all sentient beings away from the suffering of delusion. When there is no delusion, there is no cause of samsaric suffering. The essence of non-suffering is to be in awareness mind. We must simply believe and stay in that awareness. Surrender is the openness to clear, vast, limitless wisdom space. This openness means that we surrender through our practice to Buddha and his precious teaching, to luminous deity phenomenon, to all visible and invisible sublime beings, including our teacher, and to our own wisdom mind. Really sounds so simple, but we all know not so easy, right? And then one more. This is from Gar Rinpoche. As many of you know, his teacher that he met he had great teachers before he went into the prison camp, but in the prison camp, he met Khenpo Munsel. Khenpo Munsel, Munsel means dispeller of gloom, and Khenpo is one who knows, so one who knows how to dispel the gloom of samsara. In prison, Khenpo Munsel taught me this: the extent of your realization will be known when you encounter difficult circumstances. You will not know the extent of your realization when things go well. When you find yourself in a troublesome situation. So that was a quote from Khenpo Munsel. Now this is Gar Rinpoche. When you find yourself in a troublesome situation, when you are in great pain, when an intense emotion arises, only then will you know where you are at with practice. Khenpo Munsel then added, adverse circumstances will reveal your hidden faults. Adverse circumstances will reveal your hidden faults. Then Gar Rinpoche, if you are able to hold awareness unwaveringly during such a time, and thus if you are not carried away by the force of the emotion, it is a sign that you have gained experience in practice. I think that's so wonderful. Adverse circumstances will reveal your hidden faults. You know, the world is so upside down. The worldly way is, what do? We hide our shortcomings and we broadcast our virtues. I mean, especially in political seasons. Isn't that what politicians do? They're always broadcasting their virtues and hiding their shortcomings. But the Buddhist way is the opposite. You hide your virtue and you broadcast, you expose your shortcomings. And why? Because it's the power of our wisdom mind, but it's also the power of rationality. I mean, we know this in our own culture. You know, if you put things up to the light of day, if you're transparent, if you're open, if there's open discussion, whatever, then, you know, you see what's there and people can deal with it in a worldly way or, you know, in a spiritual way. It can be dissolved, but you have to bring it up, so to speak. You can't hide. And this takes courage. And this is like scary. And people do all sorts of diverting kind of things to not do this simple, bare awareness of their self, of their mind. Instead, again, they're always doing some sort of diverting kind of thing because, you know, we kind of live in our diversions, you know, we define ourselves. Our identity is really our diversions. It's amazing. The idea that maybe we're not limited to that identity, that's really something. Our idea is that we're going to be happy by clinging to our identity, and the things that threaten it, we push them away with anger, one thing or another. And the things that build our identity, we grasp onto them. This is the really fatal dynamic method that we're using all the time. The power of that is that it shows you the power of the mind right there. And that is our liberation. That's the source. The incredible power of our mind to screw ourselves up is the same power that can liberate it. We have really everything we need. And the Dharma itself, in its vastness, you know, it's so confirming and it's so confidence building. Because again, you know, you look, I see, especially on the internet and that, you know, you see so many people that have, I mean, the whole world. You find some object that's going to be of relief for you, and you put so much into that, whether they're subtle things, whether they're philosophies, whether they're individuals, whether it's you know, belief, ideology, all these different things. And the more and more you do of this Buddhist practice, and the more and more that it resonates with your life, the more and more that you start to realize the truth of it, either in even very kind of, you know, surface kind of ways or in deep ways. The more you see, you have compassion for beings because you see they're trying so hard and they're doing things that won't work. I mean, I see it with my granddaughters, not in some sort of heavy existential way, but in some, you know, some very little thing. I mean, like they don't know how a squirt gun works. and they're doing something and they're squirting their mother, and I see that that's not going to work. But they don't know. The next thing you know, they're getting a lecture or something. So it's this process of learning, and this is so wonderful, this path, because we're learning from our mistakes instead of just blind suffering. I mean, the farther you go with this, you don't know. Again, just naturally compassion for beings, because you see how they're doing it to themselves, and we see how we do it to ourselves. But on the other hand, you start thinking like, oh my goodness, if there weren't the Dharma, if there weren't this teaching of something, of this realization, and whatever level of realization you have, we have the wonderful teachings that we get on the 5 paths and the 10 bhumis. And so it prevents a certain kind of arrogance, because you can see intellectually there's more, and you have confidence from the distance that you've traveled, or confidence in seeing the beings like His Holiness Dalai Lama. There's just many ways that you can have confidence and confidence building things. But to realize this tremendous body of teachings, 2,700 years, and you can see the results of it. I mean, intellectually, it's so helpful because they're tools, they're intellectual ways that we can communicate. It's not just some ineffable experience that can't be communicated, but rather, it's like Nagarjuna said, you have the relative teachings, the absolute teachings. And he said, but we get to the absolute by the relative. So in a sense, the relative teachings are superior if you're going to talk in those terms. This is something that's very strong in our particular tradition. Jigten Sumgön's work, the Gongchik, is this understanding that what look like the preliminary practices are the profound practices. We have to give up some of our intellectual arrogance, perhaps, but nonetheless, it all has a self-correcting process, a self-correcting quality. You do it, you can be even doing it wrong, and yet somehow you're wearing out of your mistaken ideas and your stupidity. And there's something that's unexamined, that's unacknowledged, that's kind of eating away at this rigid structure that we've created in our minds of our self. So Tenle Norbu and now Gaura Rinpoche, even our mistakes, even the sufferings we have, immediately our mind is there, and we can see. And so it shows us where we need to work, and we can have encouragement too. And that, oh my goodness, 20 years ago, that would have been a major crisis here. But somehow I'm just upset or not upset at all. When you're in some sort of a conflict with someone, and there's actually a natural moment that you're thinking about them instead of how you're going to get back at them, something remarkable has happened. Okay. There was something else that I wanted to talk about a little bit too, because I read something today which struck me as interesting, in that, I mean, no one knows their karma. It's so vast. There's this famous story about the last night of Buddha's life. He was in some pain. I guess he had a back problem. And then this last meal that he had, they don't know from the text. It was said that he had pig's food, or it can be translated different ways. So they don't know if it was pork or if it was like mushrooms that would be pig's food. So he's having stomach cramps and that kind of thing too. But at any rate, he was lying and resting in this little hut. And his students, of course, were very protective of him. He was actually traveling. I mean, they were going from where they had been, down by, I'm trying to think. I don't think it was Varanasi, but it was Rajgir, the cities that he spent most of his teaching time to. He was walking north, and people sometimes think kind of romantically that maybe he was trying to get back to Lumbini, where he had been born, or to Kapilavastu, where um, his family had been, where he started his quest. But nonetheless, he was in Kushinagar, which is on the way. So no one really knows. But at any rate, he was on this little hut, and his students were protecting him, of course. And out of the dark, out of the night, came this yogi who traditionally, I think they say he was 100 years old, and he had been meditating for years in the foothills around Kushinagar. And through his psychic power, he knew that the Buddha, a great teacher, was nearby. And this man had a question. He had something that was really a doubt for him that he was trying to work with. And so he came and he approached the hut. He found out where the Buddha was. He approached the hut, and Shariputra and Moggallana were guarding, basically. Maybe Ananda too. I might have a couple of the names wrong. But of those three, certainly they were there. And he wanted to have an audience with the Buddha. And they said, no, it can't be. He's just very little time left for him. And you sort of missed your chance. They didn't quite say it like that. But nonetheless, the Buddha was aware of this and said, let him in. And he came in, he had an interaction with the Buddha, and he was asking something about, people who all claim to have the truth. And you have all these people individually who claim to have the truth, or different traditions and that, and they're all fighting with each other about it. And he was upset about this. And the Buddha gave him some instruction that liberated his mind. He had an awakening there while talking to the Buddha, or the release of that doubt, the dissolution of that doubt. And he walked back out into the night. And of course, Moggallana and Shariputra, they were enlightened beings. They could recognize what had happened. And they went back to talk to the Buddha. And Moggallana especially, he was known for his great psychic powers. And he said to the Buddha, he said, what happened here? He said, I checked when this man wanted to see you. I checked with my mind. I went back like 100,000 lifetimes. I didn't see any connection with his mind stream with any Buddhas. Nothing. And the Buddha said, well, that's true. But if you went back 200,000 lifetimes, he had made an offering to a previous Buddha. And this was the result of that pure devotion. It shows you the power of the mind. Just one pure moment is enlightenment, if we know, if we're realized. This is just so incredibly helpful and incredibly wonderful. So nonetheless, the faith that's required and the teachings and the time, we kind of wonder, we don't know our karma. But I've really wondered sometimes, just in kind of a fanciful way, what is the story with all of us? Because, it's very unusual in this culture for people to have sincere confidence, sincere faith, and even more to come in contact with these great teachers, because we're truly in contact with great teachers. I mean, really historical level teachers. Dalai Lama, Garchen Rinpoche, Chetsang Rinpoche. I mean, these are not ordinary beings. In one sense, they're completely ordinary. But in another way, this is just really remarkable. And I think to myself, what is it with us? I mean, I just see America as kind of like a happy barbarian land, very rough with the emotions, especially. And a lot of good intentions, perhaps, but a lot of other tensions that aren't so great. But not necessarily, what you think of when you read of like ancient India, or the subtlety of Japan, for instance, the deep faith of Tibet in harsh conditions, harsh climate. So what is it about us? And then I came across this interesting idea today from someone who was writing about Chogyam Trungpa. And uh, let me see. Yeah. This is a wonderful Tibetan Lama who recently died. Gretchen and I met unknowingly in 1981 in Nepal. We met him in Nambu Buddhaya, which is the place where it's believed the Buddha in his previous lifetime offered his body to a starving tigress so as to save her cubs from starvation. And Trungpa Rinpoche went to Boulder. This is after Trungpa Rinpoche died. Really great teachings, great teacher, but the organization had a lot of troubles after Trungpa passed away, which is not unusual in history. I realize another wonderful thing about Tibetans is this kind of stability they have of institutions. You have a monastery, there it is. Not an easy thing to build. And there it is with, stones and bricks and everything. And so whatever kind of temporary worldly problems they may be having in their sangha or whatever, there's still a monastery there. And eventually someone's reborn, other people come, time passes. All these things, there's more stability in the culture itself. There's less throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Whereas for us, it doesn't have that depth. I'm not speaking of us individually, but I mean culturally, people all the time. What was that movie that was it my old mind? I can't remember actress's name anymore. The one who was in the pizza movie, Julia Roberts. Yeah, there was this movie. I think she was in it, which was like love, food, and something. I can't remember. This woman who just sort of walks away from everything, but not in a spiritual way. It's just going around the world, just kind of like, seeking pleasure and satisfaction. You just so easily walk away from stuff. This is America. It's some of it's our Protestant culture, I think. It's like if it's not working, you just start a new church. Your church, you have all these evangelical churches out there, all with like a charismatic leader, and then they have some sort of disagreement. People go somewhere else. It's always happening. But the Tibetans had this unbelievable stability. I think that's a helpful thing. So at any rate, we're doing the challenge of trying to build an institution in the West. The Tibetans already kind of had it, and that solved a lot of problems for them long term. But nonetheless, so Trungpa Rinpoche went to Boulder, where it was all this difficulty they were having after Trungpa died. And interestingly, the topic of his lectures were Kamalashila's 8th century treatise on the stages of meditation. So Kamalashila was an Indian monk who came to Tibet way back in the beginning. And it's said that the reason that Buddhism was finally successfully planted in Tibet, and planted it had been, were because of the coming together of 3 great individuals. Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava, that is, on the Tantric teachings. You had King Trison Detsen, so you had the authority of the state and you might call it the secular world, completely on board in a spiritual way. And then Kamalashila, this pure Indian monk who taught the basic meditation, the stages of meditation. His Holiness Dalai Lama is taught on this text. So this is what Trungpa Rinpoche was teaching on in the midst of this kind of institutional, organizational crisis and spiritual crisis that these people were experiencing without their teacher gone. So Kamalashila had composed the stages of meditation, this treatise, in order to help the people of Tibet come through a similar crisis. They too were struggling with the polarities between yogic isolation and monastic hierarchy, between yogic autonomy and monastic rules, between yogic spontaneity and monastic curricula. The stages of meditation were sutra teachings, as opposed to Tantra. But in Kamalashila's middle way, the student's mastery of the perfections in the Mahayana Sutras was considered an essential step in the mastery of the Vajrayana texts. So this is so key for us. What that means in simple terms is that students can't really make use of tantric deity visualization until they have stabilized access concentration through shamatha, through calming the mind meditation, and established the view of emptiness through vipassana. Trungpa realized that 20th century Americans were having a similar problem to those 8th century Tibetans. They were rushing into the Vajrayana views and methods without being properly grounded in the perfections, the paramitas. And thus, Trungpa used his lectures to provide some insight into the importance of the gradual path. So this is so interesting because with sufficient devotion, the practice of the Tantra is the practice of shamatha and simultaneously the practice of vipassana. But I'm told that traditionally it is as being mentioned here, that the Tantric teachings were not given out so easily, so soon, so to speak. The student would do the, extensive meditations of calming the mind, insight into the nature of the mind, and then with a deeper realization of emptiness, the state of things as it is, then they would introduce the Tantra because there was understanding then, one, that this visualized Buddha was empty also, less chance to attach to it, and less ego involvement. So there was a natural kind of humility, a natural kind of openness, a natural kind of protection and safety, and all that's good. But when I saw these problems, because I've seen this, there are these problems in the West, especially in America. And it was so interesting to me to think of 8th century Tibetans having a similar kind of challenge. Because think, they had been great warriors. They had conquered the capital of China. Through their political power and military power, the emperor of China gave his daughter to the emperor of Tibet as a peace offering. According to some accounts, she brought the first Buddha figure to Tibet, to the barbarian Tibetans. But here they were, so powerful. They had conquered Central Asia, including the capital of China, as I said. So you've seen like a National Geographic and things and PBS, those incredible terracotta statues that they found buried in Xi'an, the old capital of China. Like the emperor had this whole army, and each one of them has individual face and everything. And they're really quite outstanding artistically. That was the capital that Songtsen Gamsun conquered. Really kind of amazing. But nonetheless, I just kind of sparked at thinking about us, all of us, as somehow karmically connected to these 8th century Tibetans, doing something really, really wonderful. It's engagement with the Dharma, which can benefit their whole country, their whole civilization as it has. In the end, it was the Tibetans that converted the Mongols. You had Mongol Genghis Khan conquering everything, all the way to Vienna. And it was his grandson who was converted to the Dharma and, allowed the Tibetans to run their own affairs, but he controlled their foreign policy. That was the idea. But importantly, Tibetan lamas went to Mongolia, and Mongolia developed great lamas themselves. And then when the Mongolians, the history of China is back and forth between, native Chinese like Han people being head of the dynasty, but then Mongol people or Manchus, other non-Han people. It was these non-Han people that brought the Vajrayana back into China, where it had died out from coming from India earlier, indigenously, so to speak. So we're in this remarkable time of change in the world. We're certainly experiencing that now. There's great change going on. And in this great moment the Tibetans did something rather remarkable. And I'm thinking we're right there. Without us knowing it, I think we have a certain kind of karma. But more importantly, whether that's true or not, I mean, who knows really? But at the same time, the teachings that were given at that time to stabilize Tibet, this two-fisted kind of approach, the incredible teachings of Kamalashila, the sutric kind of meditations, the things that people can so relate to with our dualistic mind. The teachings are all there and accessible. You don't have to posit some sort of remarkable mindset or realization or anything like that. You can just talk. This is what the Dalai Lama is doing all the time, just speaking in the language that humans understand. But at the same time, lurking there in the background, so to speak, or in the immediacy for those that have the devotion, the especial methods of the Tantra, which use the qualities of a degenerate time, use when the emotions are especially strong and when virtue is upside down, virtue and non-virtue upside down. So this struck me as something that's, um, meaningful to us. Let's see if he says anything else here that I can use. Yeah, he's making a statement here, the implication that Trungpa's organization had fallen apart after he died precisely because the leadership had only an intellectual grasp of the view. They had forgotten Padmasambhava's maxim, though your view should be as vast as the sky, keep your conduct as fine as barley flour. So when it came to truly taming the mind, Trungpa's Dharma had barely set foot on the path. Trangu told them that to reestablish the samaya of genuine refuge in bodhicitta, they needed to be grounded in meditative stability and experiential insight. As Kamalashila put it, quote, this is from the 8th century, we must train in the ways of the world, train in stable contemplation, and train in the knowledge that passes beyond the world. So these are the three excellencies. Training in the world, Shila, is ethics. So we start out with ethics. We train in the ways of the world. That's what he's calling that, ethics. We train in stable contemplation, which is samadhi, meditation. And we train in the knowledge that passes beyond the world, prajna. A bodhisattva, this is still Kamalashila speaking, a bodhisattva must train in both method and knowledge. Buddhahood cannot be achieved through method alone or through knowledge alone, but by mastering both, the rank of a Buddha is within our reach. I think that's so profound. We must train in the ways of the world, train in stable contemplation, and train in the knowledge that passes beyond the world. This is the greatness of the Dharma. You can't really call it a religion, but you can't call it worldly either. It's the middle way, as the Buddha said himself, between the two extremes, the extremes of just the only thing that exists is what we can sort of see with our senses or infer, or this is kind of like useless, and we have to be emboldened and attached to some sort of transcendent view, but transcendent view that rejects this world that appears to us. The Buddha had the middle way between the two. It's really, really kind of dicey, but in the end, it's what liberates us, because we're not rejecting, we're just seeing into. Let's see. And then Trangu's final lecture at Boulder, he said that until we achieve the final rank of a completely perfected Buddha, we progress gradually from the first and second bhumis to the 10th and 11th bhumis. Through this meditative equipoise, wisdom gradually increases. And through wisdom, meditative equipoise, gradually increases. It's like rubbing two sticks together to create a fire. Eventually, the fire begins to consume the sticks themselves, and as they dissolve indistinguishably into the flames, Buddhahood is achieved. So there you go. This teaching, there was this debate in Tibet, the four of us from our center, who went to Tibet. We went to the very place where this debate took place. And this is the great debate that happened in Tibet between Kamalashila and one Chinese master who taught instantaneous enlightenment. And although a moment of realization you can say is instantaneous, still what won the debate and was established in Tibet, there's still a lot of questions. Actually, His Holiness Chetsang Rinpoche has done a lot of investigation of ancient texts. That book that Megan and Sultram translated about the previous non-Buddhist emperors of Tibet has a lot of interesting things in there about the Chinese Buddhism and the interaction between China and Tibet way back when. This is actually Megan's area of study in the Silk Road, ancient Silk Road. So there's a lot of things that aren't necessarily just the traditional view of that debate, but nonetheless, traditionally it's told that the gradual path won out in Tibet. And I think there's something very important for us as Americans to know, because when you learn the teachings, like when Khenpo teaches on the 5 paths or the 10 bhumis, it's very helpful to know that there's a gradual accomplishment, you might say, because especially in our culture, we get very excited. We don't want to chew willow bark. We want aspirin. We don't want to chew cocoa leaves. We want cocaine. We always want the active ingredient, and then we don't have to do any of the necessary work. It's kind of like that. We're a little bit lazy and ambitious at the same time. So this feeling, it takes such pressure off one that you realize you just do the practice. You work on your motivation. You're working on your concentration. You're working on your understanding and insight and study, all of it together. We don't have to reject one part of the teachings because somehow we think it's like some sort of obstacle to realization. It happens unbidden, you might say. It's the strangest thing in the world. The more that our ego is involved, even wanting realization, it's actually an obstacle. So when the ego's dropped for a moment, but all that inertia, and I mean inertia in the sense that Newton used it, like momentum. It's all this power of this practice that you've done. It's in your mind stream, even though we don't see. You can suddenly have an insight, and again, can come in what seems to be not an opportune time. There are no limits with this. In a sense, there are no rules. And yet having all these rules helps us to focus, helps us to walk on the path and give it a reality that's necessary for us to have confidence in it. All right. Well, that's enough for me tonight. Forgive me, I got a little bit carried away. But I was very struck by the oneness, you might say, of the Tantra and the Sutra. It's not two different things. Excuse me. And yet for practice reasons, intellectual reasons, so we can understand, it's kind of presented in that way. There's nothing other than shamatha and vipassana. And we're very fortunate here because, one, this is what Khenpo is trained in, this whole range. So you kind of know when people kind of go off in one direction, intellectual direction or not, and knowing what's necessary to do to be on the path. And yet it's wide open and free at the same time, not restrictive. So, all right. So forgive my prolixity here. But first, any questions before we conclude?
There's only 2 of us in the room here tonight. We need some help from you folks on Zoom.
No questions, but we really appreciate today's lessons and teachings. Very good. Thank you, Frank.
Well, thank you.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you, Roberto. Always hopefully we all inspire each other, I must say. And that's good. Okay, so let's
I just want to
yeah.
say, I find it really encouraging what you said about, um, we don't have to know where we're going. Someone else knows what to do. If we just follow the practice, it's going in the right direction. I find that encouraging. Really, thank you.
Yeah, no, you're entirely welcome. I mean, we see it in our meditation, you know. It's like the sense that we have of our self-grasping is so strong and so habitual. I mean, we don't have to manufacture it. It's there. We've manufactured it already. And so the ego wants to take credit for its own dissolution, which is just really a paradox within paradox.
Very good.
I'm going to make, instead of just relaxing into the meditation, letting it do its natural thing, instead, we're going to make the meditation work. So our ego is just completely
It's
entwined.
very helpful, that, and it's reassuring. Let go and do it, man.
Right. Just let go and do it, not to worry. So,
Right.
Thank you.
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more about surrender?
Yeah. I very much, yeah.
The continuous reverence.
Yeah. That struck me today too. I mean, it was just Tinley Norbu was a genius.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that, again, in our culture, we have this idea of surrender. It's like some sort of, I don't know, it's like you're surrendering to just, you just totally gone to seed. You're giving up any kind of discipline and you're just, letting it rip. Or we're surrendering to some sort of cult or belief or something that's kind of inherently unnatural and not really us. I mean, again, it's all just also alienating. But what Rinpoche said here of this surrendering into this open awareness, that's so completely different that the words almost seem to mislead. There's a verse in the it said that there are two ways of coming to Buddhahood without meditation, one tantric and one sutric. The tantric method is POA, that at the moment of death, you can attain to Buddha Amitabha's Pure Land or even attain to full Buddhahood through this method that's done without meditation. That means a whole career of meditation. This one technique can do that. But in the sutric path, the way to Buddhahood without meditation is this practice composed by Chagme Rinpoche. We had in Rochester, I can't believe this, we had the current Chagme Rinpoche. He lives in Beijing. Was in Rochester. I mean, he's a Drikun Kagyu Lama. So the long aspiration prayer to be reborn in Buddha Amitabha's Pure Land, Dewa Chen, it said that in that, and this is the whole basis of the Pure Land school in China and Japan. Just this pure desire, faith, devotion to be open to Buddha Amitabha, that does it. Well, in that verse, and it's a long verse, it talks about like a vulture out of a net, that this moment of freedom can actually be scary because we're so habituated to wanting to be in our net because it's so, it's so definable. I know the limits of who I am and what I can do and my culture and my ethnicity and blah, 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 blah. We take comfort in that net. We're trying to protect ourselves from the openness of our own mind. It's so paradoxical. And so it says that even the vultures out of the net, there can be a moment of fear. Really remarkable, but it dissipates because in the vastness of the
so the surrender precipitates the freedom, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And in the surrender, and you can think of it, you just doing the practice or meditation. I mean, think of it, how all of our obstacles come up. I mean, that's what really drives people away from this kind of practice is that it brings up the problem, so to speak. And yet, with the faith, you understand that these obstacles, everything, are like adventitious clouds. They're covering the sun, but they aren't the sun. And although they look completely thick and we can't see through them, it seems, still the light's coming through. And so with our faith, we start to have confidence in that I know the sun's out there. And if people say, well, you don't see it, do you? And I say, but there's light everywhere right now. So this complete blending of the sutra and the tantra, the complete blending of our dualistic mind with our vast mind. We don't have to try to create one or the other. We're just seeing things as they are. It's just completely, subtle, paradoxical, and powerful. And yet, it's said that he who knows does not say, he who says does not know. That's the situation we're in. So it comes down to faith, and that surrender requires faith.
Mm-hmm.
But again, surrender into what? Into the vast openness, self-aware wisdom mind.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, we're all back in the saddle. We'll get back on topic next week. And we dedicate the merit from this evening to all motherly sentient beings, every single one. We look up to these sentient beings and we realize that we have this precious opportunity, this precious human life through the sacrifices that they have made, this incredible string of birth after birth after birth, mother after mother after mother, father after father after father, sacrificing, even doing, dualistic kind of negative things, not negative with a capital N, but, making sure that we had food, even if someone else didn't, keeping us alive. So we have a tremendous gratitude, obligation to these sentient beings, and we look up to them rather than looking down on them. We look up to them and make it our work to liberate them forever and ever and ever. And in that is our liberation. We dedicate all of that to them tonight. Svaha. Okay. Okay, Keiki.